Dear panelists, dear attendees, a very warm welcome to this session discussing vulnerability in the context of displacement. So a few housekeeping rules to start with. We have 3 papers to be presented. Each paper will have 15 minutes. So the presenters will have 15 minutes to present their ideas to you. And then we will have a Q&A session. If you want to post your question or comment, please use the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom. Please keep in mind that this session is recorded. And if you have any other questions, please also put them in chat, and we will be monitoring and asking the panelists after their presentations. So we will start with the first paper presented by Mackenzie Seaman and Dr. Nassim Majidi, Incorporating the Accompanied Child in Child Protection, a case study on returns. Please, the floor is yours.
Great, so I'll just share my screen here and we can get started. So great, so today we are going to discuss accompanied children in child protection and refugee protection work, as well as migration protection work. And in recent years, there has been growing efforts to emphasize the diversity of migrant children, similar to the appreciation of diversity among adult migrants. And this flows from the recognition that not all migrant children endure the same vulnerabilities, have the same experiences, and exhibit the same factors for resiliency. The distinctness and diversity of child migrants come from child migrants' unique personal characteristics and experiences, as well as the larger context in which they live their lives. This context is in part shaped by the programming and policies the relevant stakeholders in the field have created to direct and shape child migrants' experiences. And in other words, how we perceive vulnerability directly impacts who is vulnerable and who is deserving of protection among child migration. A great example of the recognition of child migrant diversity is gendered work focusing on migrant children. And these children, just as adults, live gendered lives, and there's increasing recognition of the importance of focusing on subgroups such as refugee girls and refugee boys, as well as child refugees of diverse sexual orientation and gender identities. For example, something from the context in which I'm personally familiar is a program called Kicking Without Borders, and it recognizes sport as a key facilitator for supporting social adaptation and a potential entry point for teaching job skills. And this program has conducted specific and targeted outreach to girls and young women who often are excluded from such sport-focused programming. However, when we speak of such vulnerabilities and factors for resiliency, we often have built-in assumptions about who is more or vulnerable and who is less or not vulnerable. And this is particularly true for divisions of migrant children according to family status, namely treating children as unaccompanied or accompanied. In such discussions, the vulnerability of unaccompanied migrant children is a tenet in child migration and child refugee work. And this stems from the belief that being both a child and unaccompanied produces a specific and pressing vulnerability, which governments must address. One can see this in the plethora of programming focusing on this group, as well as the specific legal protections afforded to unaccompanied, as well as separated children in international, regional, national, and local laws and policies. However, such conclusions regarding unaccompanied child migrants as being ubiquitously more vulnerable are incomplete, given that there's a dearth of rigorous empirical comparison between unaccompanied refugee minors and their accompanied counterparts to validate such claims of heightened vulnerability due to family status. And this also includes and is relevant for child migrants more broadly. Indeed, the uncomplicated and deterministic view and the direct relationship between the presence of adult caregivers and increased resiliency stands in contrast to recent efforts evidencing the agency and resiliency of URMs as well as young refugees. Scholarship highlighting the resiliency of unaccompanied refugee minors, not in spite of, but because of their status, as well as the ambiguous impact family can have on young refugees' experiences, indicates that families' impact may be much more complex than originally theorized. This focus on the vulnerability of unaccompanied migrant children, of which child refugees are a part, has thus left a gaping programmatic and knowledge gap in terms of accompanied children and how we can best protect their needs and desires and capacities. Who are accompanied children? What are their experiences? Are they vulnerable or resilient in specific ways? In many ways, we do not know the answers to these questions. In the EU, in the refugee context, we do know that the vast majority of unaccompanied refugee children at the time of asylum were largely older minors, between the ages of 14 and 18, while accompanied refugee children are more likely younger and embedded within families. We also know from a handful of studies that accompanied children do perform better in terms of mental health outcomes. However, there is at least one study which sheds doubt on such findings when it controlled for country of origin. In other words, both the young age of accompanied migrant children and that there is doubt regarding the mental health outcomes of accompanied children indicate that there is benefit or should cast doubt on the ubiquitous vulnerability claim that many child actors proclaim. Thus, there's an invisibility of accompanied children in the research and practice and growing evidence that they may in some ways be more vulnerable. This has large implications for child protection work. Until we understand who accompanied children are, it will make it increasingly difficult for us to adhere to and develop protection standards for accompanied children or children embedded within families. And then my colleague Nasim will take over from here.
Thank you so much, Mackenzie. So Mackenzie was just telling you about the gap in research and empirical evidence. So it's a gap we've been trying to fill through some of our research. At Samuel Hall, here you have two pictures of two research studies we released in 2018 with Save the Children, one specifically on returns to Afghanistan and one comparing Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, so different contexts. And here on returns to Afghanistan, most of the children we interviewed, so we interviewed about 60 children for that research, which is public, were returning with their families. And so what we were interested in looking at is exactly this under-researched group, which are the accompanied migrant children, those who are part of what we would assume protective family environments, and whose rights and protection then are safeguarded at the very least by their own families. And in most cases, what we understood as we were interviewing these children is that no one else had ever talked to them before about the decision to return. Not state agencies, not organizations, not their own families. And so what we wanted to show here is, as much as there's a dearth of data across the migration cycle, perhaps where it's the most worrisome is what is supposed to be, at least in state's perspective, the end of the migration cycle upon return. We'll just expose in these next two slides what we found upon return and some very concerning elements. And I think the first is how our research shows that rights in theory are not applied in practice in a context where, when we talk about returns, states' migration considerations, migration management considerations, take over state obligations towards children. So specifically, what we found in this research is that existing safeguards of children's rights are not being fully implemented. This is still on the previous slide. So best interest procedures are very inconsistently and rarely applied. So children are returning to an environment that we know at that time in Afghanistan and again today, where they can't fully access their rights as guaranteed under the Child's Rights Convention, including the right to protection, education, healthcare. And based on the interviews that we conducted for the research, European government agencies really believed that their responsibilities ended when children arrive in Afghanistan. So the benefits provided to adult returnees, for example, on reintegration, were not being provided to child returnees. There was no child-specific, child-sensitive support either before departure or after return. So children had even less support than adults in their families or other adults in more assisted voluntary return packages. So in this spectrum of interventions from policy to programs, there was very little communication with children and no assistance given to children. On the next slide, then the results of that were really disturbing. Nearly 3/4 of the children we interviewed didn't feel safe in the returns process. As Mackenzie mentioned, they're already invisible. As I mentioned, they weren't talked to, they weren't part of the process. But they also felt endangered by the process. Over half of them reported instances of violence and coercion, the presence of the police, being escorted by the police, being particularly traumatic for them, seeing their parents being escorted, seeing themselves being escorted. So the return process was a violent process for many of them. And on arrival, as I mentioned, they received little or no support. And while, for example, at the time, 45 children had attended school in Europe, when we interviewed them after return, only about 15, so 1/3, were attending school in Afghanistan. And there were multiple issues that came out of our research, from attempts to be forcefully recruited, to children engaging in child labor, because they had to invest their energy into something for their families, but also for those who didn't go to school. And obviously related to all of the issues that are listed here on this slide, mental health needs that couldn't be addressed, and girls, specifically girls' tendencies towards suicide. And here I wanted to come back to one point on gender differences, which Mackenzie really highlighted initially, is we see that as well in the stories of boys and girls who we spoke to, boys being under pressure to work, being under pressure to take the lead in their households, girls being pressured in other ways to get married early and to take on other roles than that of a child. So in many ways, whether it was state-driven or family-driven, children were in no way protected before, during, or after return. Over to you, Mackenzie.
Thank you. So as Nasim so beautifully said, that there is really a damaging invisibility of accompanied children in both research and practice. And when you start parsing it by further relevant identity factors, such as gender, further diversified by age, further diversified by sexual orientation, there are larger silences revealed. And this is more detrimental given there's a growing evidence base that accompanied migrants may be in some ways, in very specific ways, actually more vulnerable than unaccompanied migrants, both because of their accompanied status, because of the lack of programmatic treatment and policy specificity in which they encounter in their context, and because they are more likely to be younger than accompanied migrants. The invisibility and vulnerability of accompanied migrants is even more striking, as Nasim said, in return context, which put these children in front of a fait accompli, supposedly marking the end of a journey that they did not want to end. And there are thus implications on the research, policy, and monitoring side, which involve examining the ability of children's voices to be heard, their rights respected, and monitoring these at every step of the migration process, including return and reintegration, both short-term and long-term reintegration. And through this paper, we hope to identify good practices, key gaps, and key recommendations for how child return actors can better incorporate and value the needs, perspectives, rights, experiences, and wants of accompanied migrants in order to better foster the child protection standards as they pertain to children embedded within families. And we look forward to hearing your questions, and that's it for our presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your presentation and for being on time. We are now proceeding to the second presentation. The next presenter is Sarah Edgecombe from St. Andrews University, and she will be talking about vulnerabilities of marginalized minorities. Please go ahead. The floor is yours, Sarah.
Thank you, Lydia. I'm just going to share my screen a moment. Bear with me. And I'd also actually like to say thank you to the RLI for organising this conference as well. It's really appreciated and really necessary as well. So this presentation will examine the question of what needs to change in IDP protection and how it needs to change. The focus of this presentation is how humanitarian organisations often exclude stigmatized minority ethnic groups from their programming, protection and assistance, not through intent, but more through, for lack of a better word, ignorance, I think is probably the best way of putting it. To illustrate this argument, I'm going to look at two case studies, the Roma of Iraq and the Hamid of Yemen. So these groups were chosen specifically due to their stigmatized status, their displacement in the current contexts of war or recent war, and the failure of the humanitarian community to provide adequate protection and assistance for them. I just want to make clear from the start that this sort of exclusion of stigmatized IDPs is not exclusive to the Middle East by any means. I've just chosen two Middle Eastern case studies because it's a context I'm most familiar with. But I really want to also make clear that anti-Gypsyism is rife in Europe, as is evidenced right now by the exclusionary and differential treatment that the Romani refugees from Ukraine are currently facing as well. So I don't want to single out the Middle East and sort of place it in some kind of savage slot. So within academic literature on peace and conflict and IDP protection, minority groups are often homogenized, and there's this belief that minority status is conflated with this sort of uniformly experienced system of marginalization. And humanitarian reports and research often tends to mirror that trend as well. But to homogenize minority groups is to overlook both intra and intergroup dynamics as they are positioned within a broader web of social and power dynamics. So much like Mackenzie and Nassim just pointed out, there are all these extra factors which contribute to different experiences of vulnerability. And that's something that isn't taken into account often enough. For minority groups who are also stigmatized, they often suffer from things such as having no identification documents, very few, if any, housing, land and property rights. They often have much less recourse to resources than other minority groups. And these things all combine to make them more vulnerable a lot of the time. So this presentation will highlight the consequences of a lack of sort of IDP specific research, predominantly into the Iraqi Roma, but also into the Hamid of Yemen. In short, IDPs from stigmatized minority groups are often excluded from humanitarian and protection. And I think, as my presentation will argue, it's because there isn't necessarily an interdisciplinary approach applied in humanitarian research, and there's often a tendency to kind of prioritize international thematic expertise rather than relying more on local knowledge as well. So just to provide you with some background on the Roma of Iraq, the number of Roma in Iraq is estimated between 50,000 and 200,000. No one really knows though, because they've been excluded from population censuses, basically since the formation of Iraq. And that's due to the conception that they're outsiders, that they're not from Iraq, even though they've been present in Iraq for centuries. It's really important, especially for this conversation, to recognize that historically, Roma have resided around the periphery of major cities, as well as in Roma exclusive enclaves in southern Iraq. So Roma have, until very recently, lived on the outskirts of cities such as Baghdad, Basra, and Mosul. Whilst there is very little academic literature available on the Iraqi Roma, at least in English, there's a small but distinct network of Iraqi academics who have researched these communities in depth. They're more than willing to have conversations and to cooperate and coordinate with more sort of stereotypically Western academics, but it seems like they're very often completely overlooked. So the Roma in Iraq after 2003 were brutally persecuted in the immediate aftermath of the fall of Saddam Hussein, basically due to the perception that they're immoral as a reliance of livelihoods based around music, dancing, singing, but also because there is prostitution and the selling of alcohol in some of their communities. The few reports that do exist speak of really brutal physical attacks, such as beheadings, rape, having their communities razed to the ground by mortars, having properties looted. The sort of Shia militias quite often just try to wipe them off of the Iraqi map completely. In recognition of this, the European Asylum Support Office stated in 2009 that the Iraqi Roma are among the most vulnerable, disfavored, and at risk of all the marginalized groups in Iraq. And during this immediate post-American invasion era, a lot of Roma from federal Iraq fled to Iraqi Kurdistan and also to Syria. So they've been displaced since 2003 onwards. Of course, during the war in Syria, many returned to Iraq, some to federal Iraq, but most to the Kurdish region of Iraq, where they've been sort of physically safer in many respects, but no less stigmatized. So absolutely nothing has been produced on the Iraqi Roma since the defeat of ISIS in Iraq, at least in English. There's been a very small smattering of local media reports focusing on acts of ongoing discrimination, persecution, stigmatization, but there's been no systematic research either by the academic or the humanitarian community. Dr. Hamid Alhashemi is an Iraqi scholar of sociology with a special interest in the Iraqi Roma. And he stated his certainty during an interview that the majority of Roma living around Mosul were still there right up until ISIS invaded. They would have either fled shortly before ISIS arrived because they have this history of brutal persecution on the basis of immorality, but any that didn't flee would have certainly been persecuted on the basis of their immorality. Despite the certainty amongst Iraqi scholars that Iraqi Roma were forcibly displaced from 2003 onwards, and then again from 2014 onwards with the approach of ISIS, this humanitarian community has completely failed to ensure that adequate protection and assistance is provided to Iraqi Roma IDPs in Iraq. So it's really important to remember that due to stigmatization, discrimination, persecution, the Roma faced all of these things prior to 2013, and they were already living in a state of protracted displacement, precariousness, and extreme vulnerability. Just to sort of emphasize again and again that the Iraqi Roma are amongst the most vulnerable IDPs in both Iraq and the Kurdish region of Iraq. And it kind of is a bit mind-boggling how the Yazidi IDPs receive so much attention, and quite rightly so, they absolutely should have done, but there was no international sort of uproar about the treatment of Iraqi Roma. So kind of picking up on this, during the summer of last year, I carried out some very exploratory research into the humanitarian community's relationship with the Iraqi Roma, or lack of. My research actually only ended up involving 6 interviews with researchers and humanitarian practitioners within Iraq. I'd reached out to more people, but within the humanitarian community, I often received responses such as, we can't speak to that because there are no Roma in Iraq, or we don't know anything about them. We know they live in poverty, but they're not displaced. Therefore, they're not part of the humanitarian remit. And these responses were coming from people quite high up in the humanitarian protection cluster. One protection cluster member explained to me that the protection cluster mandate only dates back to displacement triggered by ISIS. And this statement really struck me as quite strong and raised two key questions, really. The first was, why have Roma displaced by ISIS and the resulting conflict been entirely overlooked by the humanitarian community in Iraq? And the second is, why has no support been given to the Roma who have been living in protracted displacement since 2003 or shortly afterwards? Prejudice and stigma undoubtedly play a role here. As 2 researchers pointed out, whilst talking about the humanitarian response to the Roma in Syria, which is a context which sort of very much mirrors Iraq, there's usually a really strong feeling amongst humanitarian practitioners, both national and international, that they weren't living a particularly good life before. So what's the difference if they're displaced? And that also kind of intermingles with this misperception that Roma remain nomadic, which they don't anymore a lot of the time. One researcher also pointed to how it's quite common to hear the phrase, they never had shoes to begin with, so why do we need to give them shoes now? This kind of perception that we're not going to return them to a state better than they were in before. So what's the point in intervening? And that's quite harmful, or very harmful in many ways. An Iraqi national humanitarian employee for an international NGO informed me that many of the problems the Roma face in accessing aid result from the institutional and public perception that they're not Iraqi nationals and therefore they don't deserve assistance. An international humanitarian worker also told me that when the humanitarian community in Iraq refer to minorities, they're usually referring to Yazidi, in some cases Shabbat, Christians, but Roma are never ever mentioned. So I should point out here that this presentation definitely raises more questions than it answers. But the case study of the Iraqi Roma IDPs highlights the need for systematic research among IDPs from stigmatized, marginalized groups. So such research would represent a transferable opportunity for improvement of policy and programming across varying landscapes of displacement and different geographic concepts. So I'm talking about the Iraqi Roma and a little bit about the Mahamasheen today, but what we learn and what we apply to them in the future can be equally transferable to stigmatized, marginalized groups in conflict zones the world over. And this presentation will make the case for improved collaboration between researchers and humanitarian practitioners and how vital this will be in securing any positive change. But as the next case study will show, research on its own, especially if it's not suitably comprehensive and not disseminated, doesn't always make an awful lot of difference. So the Mahamasheen in Yemen were among the first to be displaced by the current conflict. They've struggled to access community shelters and camps due to stigmatization by other IDPs. Humanitarian aid to the community is far less consistent for the Mahamasheen than other groups. Yet because they live in conditions of squalor, their pictures are often the ones that are put on the front of various news reports, humanitarian reports, and what have you, talking about IDP protection in Yemen. Despite the fact that the aid to the Mahamasheen is really inconsistent, they remain really heavily reliant on aid. But in situations where NGOs distribute aid through what they perceive to be trusted community leaders or religious leaders, the effect is actually that Mahamasheen are completely excluded from such distributions or such sort of being added to needs assessments through that way because they are so heavily stigmatized by the community. And reflecting the situation of the Iraqi Roma, the Mahamasheen are also perceived by many Yemenis as not being from Yemen, originating from elsewhere, and therefore not being deserving of aid, which is directed towards nationals. And so you see locals often resenting Mahamasheen receiving aid. The Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, in its 2022 Humanitarian Needs Overview for Yemen, reported that makeshift sites are believed to be hosting some of the country's poorest and most vulnerable IDPs, and that Mahamasheen are believed to be living in approximately 41% of these sites. In the same report, OCHA stated that the Mahamasheen are one of the groups who face exclusion from basic services and humanitarian assistance. In 2019, this was picked up as well. An analysis by the Protection Cluster in Yemen showed that the effectiveness of the humanitarian response and meaningful access for all were undermined by the limited understanding amongst humanitarian actors, in this case talking about international NGOs and UN agencies, of groups at risk of exclusion. But really importantly, there was a complete lack of understanding of factors which contribute to their exclusion. So this brings me to my final slide. How do we improve humanitarian provision for stigmatized minority IDPs? And again, if I just refer back to Mackenzie and Nassim's presentation as well, it all centers around talking to the affected communities, talking to Iraqi Roma, talking to Mahamasheen. You often hear that these groups are too hard to reach or they're nomadic, so they can't be reached, but that's just an excuse. It's easy to access them. It just takes additional funding, targeted practice, probably a bit of additional sort of creative programming as well. So I just want to take this opportunity really to advocate for earmarked funding for such research and programming. And I really want to emphasize the need for improved collaboration between researchers and humanitarian practitioners, and to advocate for a shift away from this heavy reliance on international experts on thematic areas, to kind of bring in more anthropology, to bring in more local experts, to reach out to scholars from the countries that humanitarian communities are operating in. It's really crucial that a power analysis is written into humanitarian research, including needs assessments as well. These needs assessments also need to contain open questions in recognition that a template approach to humanitarian practice or peace building is useless where stigmatized minorities are concerned. They have very unique experiences, very unique vulnerabilities, and only through providing them the opportunity to provide free-formed open answers will we really find out what they need and the best ways to kind of go about it, with input from them and being very much led by them as well. And I think that's about it, really. I think the key question that probably comes of this is, how do we encourage the dismantling of stigmatization of certain groups at the local level, which would aid integration, reintegration, and more fair access to humanitarian assistance? But especially in the case of the Roma, how do we address the stigmatization at an international level as well? As I said before, anti-Gypsyism is rife. Everybody was really concerned about the Yazidi, which was wonderful to see, but conversely, nobody really cared about the Roma. Part of that was because nobody knew what they were going through, but then why did nobody know? I think we need to really analyze that. But again, just emphasizing, we really need a power analysis to be built into needs assessments, to be built into community mapping, social mapping, and then the humanitarian programming and planning that comes from that. And that's me. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sarah, for this fascinating presentation and for indicating these gaps that exist and providing some advices on how the situation can be improved. So now we are moving to our third panelist, Tatiana Morais from Universidade Nova de Lisboa, and she will be talking about sexual and gender-based violence among refugees. So please, Tatiana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Good afternoon to everyone. And thank you also to the Refugee Law Initiative for this opportunity. Before I start, I would like to dedicate this presentation to in the memory of Professor Chrisman Amir. It was thanks to her that I was able to do fieldwork in Israel, and today's presentation draws a great deal on that fieldwork. So today I will be sharing some thoughts with you about tensions and how these tensions may help us to identify the legal framework in certain asylum countries which may be reinforcing vulnerability, especially asylum-seeking women's vulnerability. This presentation draws from a paper that I published with Professor Gibbs back in 2020, and we focused on tensions in Israel dataset in that specific paper. Today I'm going to be drawing from Greece and Israel datasets. So my PhD research focuses on sexual gender-based violence in the country of asylum. It is a socio-legal cross-cultural study and includes 58 conversational interviews with non-participant observation and literature review as well. I've conducted fieldwork in 3 countries, Greece, Uganda, and Israel. And as I mentioned before, this paper in specific draws from Greece and Israel datasets. More precisely, 43 conversational interviews with refugee and asylum-seeking women and with key informants. So without further ado, regarding this paper, the objective is to identify the gap between theory and practice through tensions, and also to identify and examine tensions which create or reinforce the vulnerability of asylum-seeking women, hence emphasizing their risk and exposure to SGBV. From Greece and Israel datasets, we were able to identify a primary tension, which is the state's international obligations versus its national interests. Professor Gibbs and we first identified this primary tension in the Israel dataset in the paper that I mentioned you before. And we also identified that this primary tension creates secondary tensions. We identified 3 of them. The order-disorder tension that was previously identified by Page in 2011, the permanent temporariness tension, which was also identified back in 2020 by Professor Birger, and last, the rejection acceptance tension. So regarding the tension order-disorder, this tension, as I mentioned before, was previously identified by Page, and it was intended to stress the negative impact of Israeli legal framework on Eritrean asylum seekers. So Eritrean and Sudanese asylum seekers who arrived in Israel between 2005 and 2012, they faced a legal limbo because Israel banned the submission of asylum claims both by Eritreans and Sudanese individuals until 2012. This change in 2013, Israel, they admitted asylum claims by Eritreans and Sudanese individuals since 2013. However, they also increased the bureaucratic procedures with the intention to increase the chances of these asylum claims to be dismissed. As Page described in 2011, the order-disorder tension intends to guarantee that the asylum claims are unsustainable, resulting in a low rate of asylum seekers being recognized. Hence, the law at state level was designed to socially and legally create barriers to the recognition of asylum claims, with the intention of letting the asylum seekers know they were not welcomed, hence encouraging their voluntary departure. Similarly, in Greece, de facto refugees faced a legal limbo as well, which was aggravated by the EU relocation scheme, which fell short regarding its initial goals. Also, the EU-Turkey agreement sent mixed message regarding, on the one hand, the EU principles and its member states' international obligations, and on the other hand, their national and regional interests. Usually, this tension translated into a discrepancy between the law and the practice, negatively impacting the asylum seekers in Greece. Consequently, just like in Israel, also Greece, and we may also add the EU, there was a tension between hosting and encouraging the voluntary return of asylum seekers, which led to the second tension, the permanent temporariness tension. This tension results from a long and damaging period of time in limbo. This tension results from the chaos created by the legal order disorder, and asylum seekers' temporary situation drags on, creating what Tizé mentioned as a, and I quote, a temporal stagnation caused by legal insecurity, end of quote. This Tizé expression illustrates how both tensions are intertwined. The permanent temporariness emphasizes that the jure temporary situation of asylum seekers is in fact a de facto permanent situation due to the lack of legal status, which leaves asylum applicants trapped in the country of asylum, hence not being able to carry on with their journeys, and on the other hand, knowing that they cannot go back. This leaves asylum seekers suspended in legal limbo, hence stuck in precarious conditions, which aggravate their risk and exposure to SGBV, which then leads to the third secondary tension that we identified in our paper, the rejection acceptance tension. So the mixed signals sent by the legal message and by the political message as well, they impact the hosting society, triggering mixed feelings and behaviors. While some segments of the population accept and welcome the asylum seekers, for instance, we have examples of members of civil society and grassroots movements that supported them, others did not and exploited asylum seekers' vulnerable situation through labor and sexual exploitation, which help us to identify how some of these asylum seekers are more vulnerable to SGBV. So both types of tensions that we identified, the primary and the secondary tensions, they reveal a gap between theory and practice. Both countries of asylum are internationally obliged to respect and implement the principles in the 1951 Refugee Convention and in the CEDAW as well. This includes to avoid creating legal and bureaucratic barriers with the intention to increase the unsustainability of asylum claims, or to create obstacles to access to asylum procedure. Such socio-legal chaos creates a legal limbo for asylum seekers, emphasizing their vulnerability to precarious jobs, vulnerability to homelessness, which in turn amplifies asylum seekers' vulnerability, risk, and exposure to SGBV, especially women. These tensions have an intersectional impact, which identifies an aggravated risk for refugee and asylum-seeking women to become survivors or victims of SGBV. The intersectional impact of these tensions are rooted in the structural patriarchal violence embedded and reinforced by law. Considering the European jurisprudence regarding asylum seekers' vulnerability to the state, the European Court of Human Rights decision MSS versus Belgium and Greece, we argue that SGBV targeting asylum seekers results from and reveals a structural and systematic symptom in the state which amplifies asylum seekers' vulnerable situation, hence risk and exposure to SGBV. Therefore, the evidence from both data sets showcase that all these intersecting and multiple vulnerabilities left asylum seekers, especially women and girls, more vulnerable and exposed to sexual violence, such as sexual harassment, forced prostitution, forced marriages, transactional sex, among other examples that have been reported in our interviews. Consequently, this showcases the asymmetric impact of social-legal tensions among the asylum-seeking population in Greece and in Israel, which are caused by the country of asylum legal framework, hence rooted in vulnerability to the state. Fortunately, both data sets provided evidence of good practices from the field to manage such tensions and resulted in the mitigation of asylum seekers' vulnerability to the state, especially the ones who faced an amplified risk and exposure to SGBV. So we did collect from fieldwork some examples by civil society that was trying to manage these tensions, whether the primary or the secondary tensions. So we do have examples, for instance, of the Roma community back in Greece, in Athens. They were supporting asylum seekers to access to RST procedures and to prepare for the Skype interviews, for instance. We also have the example of Irretrained Women Community Center back in Israel, and they were supporting asylum seekers and also helping them to access to basic services, among other NGOs. And we also have the example of a coalition of organizations, associations, and activists and human rights lawyers from Israel that they were very successful in presenting a petition to the Israeli Supreme Court in order, in the first moment, they were able to have a decision on partial waivers for the deposit law. And most recently, back in 2020, April 2020, a similar coalition, they were successful in having the deposit law being declared unconstitutional and thus rendered null and voided by the Israeli Supreme Court. So although there are some social legal tensions which may emphasize the asylum seekers' vulnerability to the state, especially women, and especially regarding SGBV, that's the main focus of my PhD research. Fortunately, we do have some examples from the civil society through collective and individual agency. They are are managing these tensions and disputing some sites where there were power dynamics in order to turn them in favor to asylum seekers. So despite the tensions, there's room for improvement, and there's also hope for managing them. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
Obrigada, Tatiana. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Obrigada.
Okay, thank you for all the panelists to be on time. That's great because we have a lot of time for the Q&A session. So let's start with the questions that were posted in the chat, and I will read them so that they can be recorded as well. So we have two questions to Mackenzie and Nassim. I will read them, and then I will read two more questions to each of the other panelists. So thank you for your presentation. You mentioned that there is very little research comparing accompanied and unaccompanied children. While I understand that there is very little data overall, do you think there are specific priorities as to what to focus such comparisons on? And the second question, I wondered if there are risks attached to additional involvement by children in decision-making processes for the children, say feelings of responsibility, etc., for the family. Just wondered if that had come up at all in your research at all. Thanks.
Yeah, so I can take the first question, and I'll pass over to Nassim. So I think what's really important, and also that came out in all the presentations as well as in Sarah's, is that, you know, knowledge gaps produce protection gaps. So it's really important that when we start a data collection or a research agenda, we target those areas which will have the most concrete impact on the lives of accompanied migrants. And that includes, you know, we don't need more research that silos unaccompanied or accompanied. We need a comparative research agenda. And some of the priorities, I think, which, you know, we are passionate about and Samuel Hall are passionate about is, as I said, priority entrance areas. And one of those priority entrance areas is how the left behind nature of accompanied children is not only impacting them, but also the larger household. And that can be a really great advocacy point for a national government. So understanding how accompanied migrants have more limited access to specific programming and a more constrained social system because governments assume that they're supported by their family and they don't need extra outreach can be a really impactful data point and worthy of investigation. The second is relevant to child refugees. So understanding the asylum decision process and how the ignoring of accompanied child refugees or accompanied child asylum applicants and their specific claims for asylum can have really detrimental impacts on their treatment. So for instance, again, looking at migrants of diverse sexual orientation and gender identity, they might not be out to their parents. So not understanding and having a separate interview with child migrants can be, or child refugees can be very damaging because then their specific asylum claim, which would be specific to their SOGIESC identity, would not be considered. And then I think third, and which will bridge over to Nassim's response to Nick's question, is the return side and understanding return decisions and having data on that. And there was a great report that UNICEF came out with a few years ago, I believe it was in 2019, about how accompanied children are ignored, but we need more data. One report isn't enough. And also in examining how disempowering children return decisions can have an impact from the return decision all the way to long-term reintegration. But I don't want to say too much because Nassim will take over from there, and that leads us into the next question.
Thanks, Mackenzie, and thanks, Nick, for your question. I think for us, in terms of tensions and responsibilities and blame, there was a lot of that in our discussions with the children. It was very heavily loaded. Every interview we had with them, heavily loaded with references, either very open or closed, or kind of intuitively we understood about conflicts in the household, blaming, for example, the mother, just to give you a few examples. In terms of the returnees from Europe to Afghanistan, some of them decided to return when they were stuck in asylum camps in Germany or other countries. So being stuck in limbo between, are we a refugee, are we a migrant, who are we, is anyone accepting us? And in that situation of limbo, very often the adults were living that very badly while the children were just rejoicing in being able to back outside, go to school. So the children were happy even in camps. Because in camps they had access to services that they didn't otherwise. And the parents were oftentimes the ones suffering from depression or other ailments. So there was really a contrast of the experiences by age and of course also by gender. Some of these issues were more pronounced among women, among mothers. So there were conflict in the homes where children were blaming their mothers, blaming their fathers. They had actually voiced, for many of them, not wanting to return. So even though no one asked them, they voiced it. And so this comes back to a point we were discussing with Mackenzie as well, is this feeling when they were in Europe, feeling that they can speak, they can stand up for themselves, they have the agency, yet no one heard them. They were still inaudible, invisible, but they stood up for themselves. But they were unheard. And that creates conflict, that creates tension. And so we saw it all the way back once they were home. And so, yes, I mean, to your point, there are tensions, but I don't think, and the risks are within this social cohesion of the family unit, this protective unit. But I think in many ways, I think the blame will be there in some shape or another. So there's no better solution, but I think there are definitely, in a way, more risks in terms of conflict when the children are not heard, when they're not part of the decision-making process, than when they are. Now, in terms of how they contrasted the options, obviously it was very much about, even in the camps, we could study peacefully. When we're back, we're afraid of being kidnapped and killed, which leads, as in many cases of failed returns, to children telling us that they were planning to leave alone or leave with their families. So in some cases, after return, the parents changed their mind again, were looking to sell assets and to leave again. But what's interesting, and coming back to the previous question, is some of these accompanied minors who were accompanied in the return were then contemplating unaccompanied migration. So again, there's a link to be made between accompanied and unaccompanied. And again, it's what we all know because we studied this. It's a migration cycle, and it's the continuum of experiences we have to look into. So beyond this comparative element, I think it's also the layers of vulnerability and what one leading to another. So we saw a lot of that. Yeah.
Thank you for this insightful information, and you nicely showed us how some processes just lead to other consequences. The question to Sarah from Anna in the chat. First of all, Anna is thanking you for a presentation, and she's asking, what type of implications does the existence of systematically marginalized groups, such as those you mentioned in your presentation, carry for promoting greater localization of humanitarian aid?
That is a very good question. So I think, first of all, we would just need to completely reimagine potentially how humanitarian practice is researched, how it's put into practice in real terms. I think a much greater emphasis would need to be placed on more of a twin track approach. So it would be sort of really important to emphasize social cohesion building and sensitization at the community level, if nothing else, other than kind of conveying that actually stigmatized groups are nationals, maybe highlighting the positives that they contribute towards society, and really emphasizing the way they experience displacement as so much more challenging than perhaps IDPs who aren't so stigmatized, and it's already a really challenging scenario for those guys. But sort of not so much looking at IDPs, but to give you an example, in Iraq, there's a Roma community who nobody wants to go anywhere near usually. they've had their community vandalized, they've been completely overlooked. And there's always been this kind of stereotype that the Iraqi Roma are barbaric through choice. They don't want to become civilized, they don't want to become educated. But actually a local civil society group built a school in their community, and teachers from surrounding areas who were non-Roma were kind of enrolled as volunteers to teach in these schools. And the sort of exponential shift in attitude towards the Roma that resulted just from contact with Roma was it was significant. It's all written down in a couple of news articles. If anybody's interested, email me and I'll send them to you. But I think just trying to find out how to kind of shift people's mindsets, like the Hamasheen obviously don't think they're dead, for example, just combating those really harmful stereotypes. And then I think you would basically need to go to the communities themselves and ask them, how would you feel the safest, or how would you feel it to be most effective to access humanitarian aid provision? I would not like to sit here at all and guess what they would say, because I don't have that experience, and unfortunately as yet I haven't been able to secure the funding required to get out there and do this research in person. And then of course there's the elephant in the room, which is donors as well. There's going to need to be a complete shift in donor mentality in terms of beneficiary sampling, targets, indicators, and just like such significant change is needed, and sensitization amongst the donor community as well. But I think as well, it's probably worth highlighting that it's not only stigmatized groups who are left out in certain environments when aid is distributed through community leaders. So I'm sure Naseem won't mind me mentioning that I also work for Samuel Hall, and in Afghanistan you often hear beneficiaries say, you know, I'm from a different ethnic group, or I'm from a different tribe. They're not necessarily stigmatized, but because they're not the same in terms of kinship ties and this historical kind of reliance on support networks, they often are excluded from distribution and what have you, when there is this heavy reliance on community leaders. And again, it all boils down to power dynamics as well. And I just don't think I can emphasize enough the importance of incorporating a good solid power analysis and analysis of social dynamics. So I guess that means that localization of humanitarian aid would be initially more time consuming and initially more resource consuming, but in the long term that would equate to more sustainability and a kind of better progress towards achieving durable solutions as well, potentially.
Thanks. I have a follow-up question to this. In your presentation, you mentioned that there was little data, or there was little research about the positionality of this vulnerable group before the displacement already. So, and you also emphasized there is a need to incorporate more local knowledge, more local experts in tackling these issues. So do you think engaging more local researchers, not only community leaders and not maybe local authorities that much, but also local experts into the process would somehow would help to tackle these vulnerabilities?
Yeah, definitely. I think you would need to be careful, because obviously by nature of stigmatization, people absorb these narratives without even necessarily realizing it. So even if it's just, oh, you know, Roma are nomadic, you're never going to pin them down to give them aid, there's no point. It's kind of seems quite benign, but actually the effects of that result in massive protection gaps for the Roma, who haven't a lot of the time been nomadic for generations now. So I think an emphasis on kind of reaching out to researchers rather than just community leaders, bringing both those perspectives together. So you've got the community narrative of how they're perceived and where they live and how they kind of interact with non-Roma or non-Hamasheen groups, sort of set within a broader, more kind of abstract context provided by researchers, can be really informative, I think, for the humanitarian community. It's quite common to hear during the interviews I did conduct with humanitarian practitioners. Like, we don't specifically target these guys as beneficiaries, but if they're in a geographic location, of course they'll benefit from the aid, when actually researchers say that's not what's happening at all. Locals won't let them access the points where aid is distributed. They don't often live in camps because they're not welcome, they're chased out, so they live in these kind of almost deliberately hidden communities. And although there is a degree of maintenance of invisibility as a survival mechanism, locals know where they are. Like, they're not invisible to locals, they're invisible to humanitarians who aren't familiar with the context. And I think that's a really important point that needs to be taken on board.
Great point about invisibility. Thank you. And we have a question to to Tatiana in the chat. Do you think that women, peace and security agenda might provide policy change based on reassessing vulnerability if refugee involved in the process of women, peace and security agenda as participator rather than victims?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I really do think so. I think you raise very interesting points in your question. First of all, the need to reassess vulnerability and perhaps also to deconstruct vulnerability. And there are a couple of really nice works by Professor Jane Friedman, Professor Evan Crowley, and also Paris, about deconstructing vulnerability and how the ideas surrounding vulnerability can further social marginalize certain segments of the refugee and asylum seeking population. Yes, as you mentioned, it is very important to involve refugees in the process. So here again, this idea of the agency, whether individual or collective agency, is very important. It's very important to adopt bottom-up approach to how to assess vulnerability on the one hand, to also to try to understand what refugees and asylum seekers they really want, what the project for their life, because some of them, they are, as I mentioned in the presentation, they are stuck in certain countries that they do not wish to be there in the first place, and that they see the possibility to continue their journey, it's being undermined by third variables and other circumstances. So I really do think that yes, it will be important to involve refugees and especially women, and that could be could contribute to reassess vulnerability and how we see vulnerability as well. I think that will be important. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. And now I have a more general question to all the panelists. How do you understand vulnerability? Can you maybe expand a little bit more? What was your premise when you started your research? Maybe how your understanding of vulnerability was changing through the research. And now after this panel and this comparative view on different aspects of vulnerability, what would be your perspective on vulnerability? How do you understand it? We can start with Tatiana.
Okay, thank you, Lydia. Yes, I think on my end, I have been changing the several concepts and terms, not only vulnerability, and I think that's positive because for me, one of the main goals of the PhD is also to deconstruct myself and how I see the world and everything around. And vulnerability can be framed in different aspects. I can be internally or externally, how others see myself as vulnerable or not, and how I feel, if I feel vulnerable or not. And sometimes there's a gap between trying to make others understand. And now I'm trying to think of women's study abroad and sexual gender-based, and for instance, what is happening worldwide regarding our sexual health reproduction rights. And it's sometimes there's a difficulty to make others see things and our reality from our own eyes and lenses. So there's different perspectives on one's vulnerability. We have the perspective and the ideas that, for instance, politicians have, policymakers have, and there's the population perception of what they really truly want, desire, and need. So there's a clash, I think, between different perspectives on vulnerability. I think it's healthy in the way that we can learn from each other as long as we keep our minds open and able and choose to see things from a different perspective, because sometimes it's a deliberate and convenient choice to see things from a specific point and to disregard other points of view. So I think your question is very interesting, and thank you for asking that. And it helps us to see multiple vulnerabilities, sometimes within one person and sometimes among a group of people. I'm not sure if I addressed properly your question, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Tatiana. Shall we proceed with Nassim? Yeah, sure.
Great. I'll go next because I know the more I wait, the harder it will get to answer the question. And I'm not sure I'll be able to answer it properly either, but at least in terms of our research more generally, and I think this is at the heart of kind of our research approach, is to challenge vulnerability. And I think we all recognize that there's an increasing discourse on the impact of categorizing, or as Zetter would put it, labeling groups as vulnerable, and whether this categorization, which is really Mackenzie's take on our presentation, whether this categorization can add to their exclusion. So I think where we see some of that being challenged, definitely with increased international attention, activism, research, we see this being challenged in many ways with, you know, quote unquote vulnerable and marginalized groups. We see it in the support to gender equality, to the rights of LGBTQI plus migrants and migrants with diverse sexual orientation. This is one of the research studies we're at the moment. So what we're trying to do is really go more in depth into researching what these different categories are and trying to learn from it, trying to break down these categorizations, trying to do away with some of the labels to ensure that, again, the labels don't further exclude people. So I think that's fundamental to what we want to do, is to take excluded groups out of a discourse of vulnerability first, to recognize their agency, and to promote a narrative that people, whether women, children, refugees, disabled, are not inherently vulnerable, but that actually in a lot of our research, the state, its policies, or cultural perceptions, religious perceptions, are those that create those vulnerabilities. So I think replacing the vulnerability in a kind of a bit of a different dimension and out of those usual boxes.
Great, thank you for your input, Nassim. Mackenzie, would you like to add?
Yeah, I can maybe be a bit specific about, you know, challenging vulnerability in terms of it comes to children's identities. And I think specifically in terms of being unaccompanied or accompanied, and then the subcategory of accompanied, which is separated. I think that there needs to be, as Nassim correctly mentioned, in addressing why is it that they're vulnerable. And as Nassim correctly said, it's often the context that we ourselves as child migration stakeholders are creating, that policymakers are creating. And in the context of accompanied children, it's because they're often ignored. And this is why they're vulnerable. It's not because there's something inherent necessarily to the status. And I think also something that is, you know, is part of challenging vulnerability, and which I think you see increasingly by organizations like Samuel Hall and also Save the Children, is that, you know, it's not just about vulnerability, it's about enhancing resiliency and looking at factors for resiliency and positively framing that discussion, I think is really important. And I know for instance, there's only 2 small studies that have really done comparative research on accompanied children, and they've been very small end studies comparing them with unaccompanied. And the key there was actually trying to understand from an unbiased point of view, what is vulnerability and how is it being demonstrated? And I think that's really important when we're talking about vulnerability, is to take our assumptions out of the research questions we're asking, out of our maybe advocacy agenda. And at least when it comes to children, what contributes to vulnerability, it's also important to recognize that vulnerability in terms of a definition is a risk to certain harms necessarily. So it's a risk that children are having, vulnerability to poverty, vulnerability to lack of identification documents, vulnerability to a specific thing. And when we think of vulnerability often in terms of unaccompanied children, it's very blanket, it's ubiquitous. Unaccompanied children are vulnerable, unaccompanied children are vulnerable. And this blanket term of vulnerability without reference to a specific sector, a specific risk for harm, I think undermines both the agency of child migrants and also leaves other children ignored. So accompanied migrants can't be vulnerable because unaccompanied migrants are completely vulnerable. And this lack of specificity in terms of what we're speaking of when we say vulnerability, I think is something that we can all challenge in our own work, and not just say, oh, they're vulnerable. In which way are they vulnerable and why are they vulnerable?
Thank you, Mackenzie. Sarah, your turn to add.
Thank you. I think a lot of it has already been said. I haven't got much to build on it really, but I definitely agree with what Tatiana was saying about intersectionality and different aspects of identity, kind of rendering individuals differently vulnerable in different contexts, sometimes not vulnerable at all, and other times vulnerable for varying reasons. And Mackenzie and Nassim's kind of assertion, I completely agree with it. Vulnerability isn't inherent to the individual, it's something that's socially constructed by the environment around them. I think specifically looking at the Roma, there's kind of a hard balance, because on the one hand they're sort of silenced and their voices are erased and nobody asks them what they want to say, and that silencing renders them vulnerable to many things. But conversely, if they were all of a sudden made really visible and sort of receiving what other people perceive to be too much attention or too much resources, equally that would render them extremely vulnerable as well, especially in contexts where resources are scarce and there's kind of a significant degree of sectarianism still, like in the context in Iraq. So I think it's definitely something that isn't fixed or rigid. It's very dynamic. It doesn't remain the same. And I think also kind of drawing from a more anarchist school of thought, I think it has to be recognized as well that restriction of opportunity or absence of opportunity that will have an impact for generations to come or for the span of that person's lifetime also contributes to vulnerability, because it just plays into all of the factors that have already been discussed. But yeah, there's not much more I can add to that conversation, I don't think.
Thank you for all your great contributions to this very difficult question to cover, and the question that doesn't seem to have a straightforward answer. And there are many aspects, and I especially like that you linked it to the discussion about labeling. Do we need to have like a list of who is vulnerable and who is not, and then we stick to it, or it's a more personal, as Tatiana said, how do you evaluate it? Is external or internal evaluation? Also that you link it to the context, not who is the vulnerable, but what makes a person more vulnerable or vulnerable in general. And you also link it to the question of resilience. So maybe we should think of people not as victims, but also try to look at some strong sides and some things that can help them to overcome this situation, because it's not about them, it's about the situation that they found themselves in. Great inputs, thank you so much. Since we have to finish, we have another question in the chat, and this will be the last question because we have to finish on time, that everybody can go to the keynote speaker. there is a question for Nassima Mackenzie. And in your view, how does the principle of best interest of the child from the CRS support constrained understandings of children's resiliency while still ensuring that their specific protection needs are met as applied in situations of forced displacement?
So I can take this question. I'll just give a short answer. I think it's a technical question. I think it's really interesting. So best interest of the child. I think in terms of the context of accompanied children, so best interest of the child, I can speak to BIP, so best interest procedures, and BIDs and BIA, so best interest determinations, and best interest assessments. And I think there was a position paper that was published in 2019 on guidance for, it was titled Guidance to Respect Children's Rights in Return Policies and Practices, and it's a focus on the EU legal framework. I think it's a great question in terms of, I think it's a great question in terms of who's making this decision. And if its children aren't involved, how can that possibly respect the agency of children? And how can that then possibly foster the resiliency? But there have been moves forward from the EU in terms of including accompanied children and having their voices heard. And so this position paper that I just referenced, it actually has called that accompanied children, or they say children within families, that their voices are always heard. And then in such instances, the best interest of the child, when they're participating in that discussion, when they're actively contributing to determining what is in their interest, I think that doesn't necessarily constrain understandings of children's resiliency or of their agency, let's say. But this position paper, and as the research from Samuel has indicated that we did with Save the Children, it's revealed that that's not what's happening actually. So there might be these position papers saying accompanied children in families, they need to participate, they need to be heard, but that's not actually what's happening in these best interests of the child determinations and assessments, or the best interest procedures. And so I think that's sort of the next step from a policymaker and a programmatic and an implementer side is, okay, we're recognizing increasingly that they need to be part of the conversation, but why is that actually not happening? Why is that not being implemented on the ground? Why are they not part of conversations which are contributing to the impact, to the directions their life will take, and how is that then constraining the resiliency that children are going to exhibit later in their life and into adulthood? So again, it's a bit, we have kind of the bones there, but the implementation is lacking, as evidence has indicated. I hope that answered your question. I know you're not allowed to turn on your mic, but. And then I want to add anything.
I wouldn't add anything, but I just know from previous work that Nick would probably have to add something to this. I just felt that we have in our attendees so many people that I've read and whose work I've used for our research that I think they should feel free to answer as well.
Nick, if you want to add, please do.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's such a whole complex question. I was quite glad that I wasn't being asked it. I was glad everyone else was being asked. I mean, the thing that I don't really have a great deal to add. The bit that I come back to with the work is work with the MA that we do in things is around ethics and ethics boards, and this sort of pushback around this idea that we're dealing with vulnerable populations. And my view has always been trying to push back against, people might be in vulnerable situations, but this idea that we shouldn't be speaking to people purely because of the label, or because the label is somewhat problematic. And so, and then you get into this whole area with COVID and remote interviewing, which we won't get into because I'm going way off point here. But to me, it's around this idea of what you guys have been talking about, as in people might be in a vulnerable situation because of the context, but it seems quite dangerous to be, when you read quite a lot of work on vulnerability, it seems to be sort of a blanket approach, which seems slightly problematic. But I think I'll stop there if that made some sense. But yeah, thank you for asking me. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe I actually would just like to add on that. And I think this blanket approach of vulnerability, I think what's really important is in research that we've done, you know, how would you like to be called vulnerable? I think it's something that we should all take into consideration. And, you know, when we're working with children as well. And so when you're asking questions like, oh, well, how does your vulnerability or something, you know, these are bad questions. You know, we shouldn't assume these people are vulnerable. We shouldn't be labeling them as vulnerable. They may be vulnerable in specific ways, but I think that's also part of respecting the agency and resiliency of these groups that we're working with, is not labeling them from the get-go when we're doing our research. And this blanket approach to vulnerability, I think, is increasingly discouraged, and rightfully so.
I'm afraid I must stop this fascinating discussion, and our panel probably will leave us with more questions than answers, as Sarah indicated in her presentation. Thank you, all the panelists, so much for your insightful work and for all your recommendations, and for filling the research gap that you identified, and for allowing us to think about vulnerability maybe in a slightly different way that we were thinking 90 minutes before. And I'm looking forward to see you all in the next sessions and in the plenary. Good luck to everyone. Take care.